While I was away on a work trip, my wife texted, "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." My wife and kids moved in with her lover. I simply replied, "Of course. Tell your lover I'll cancel my $500 million investor check." By midnight, they went pale. You know what's funny about life? One minute, you're standing in some overpriced Seattle hotel room, watching the rain streak down floor-to-ceiling windows like God's having a bad cry. And the next minute, your entire world gets blown to smithereens by a text message. And I'm not talking about some dramatic movie-style explosion either. I'm talking about the kind of quiet destruction that happens when someone you've spent 6 years building a life with decides to drop a nuclear bomb via iPhone. I was on day 2 of what was supposed to be a routine 3-day work trip. Nothing fancy, just another round of meetings with potential partners. The kind of soul-sucking corporate theater where everyone pretends to be excited about synergistic opportunities while secretly calculating how much money they can squeeze out of each other. The hotel coffee tasted like someone had filtered it through a gym sock. But hey, when you're staying at the Grand Hyatt on the company dime, you learn to appreciate the finer things in life, like terrible coffee and overpriced room service. I was actually feeling pretty good about myself, if I'm being honest. Logan Pierce, CEO of Northbridge Infrastructure Group, master of his domain, about to close a deal that would make everyone involved obscenely wealthy. At 36, I'd built something real, something that mattered, something that could fund private schools and lake houses and all the other crap that supposedly proves you've made it in America. Then my phone buzzed. Now, I should mention that my phone buzzes a lot. CEOs don't get the luxury of silence. There's always some crisis brewing, some investor having second thoughts, some competitor trying to poach our best people. But this buzz was different. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was some primal instinct that kicks in when your life is about to go sideways. But I knew before I even looked at the screen that this wasn't going to be good news. The message was from Sabrina, my wife of 6 years, mother of my 2 kids, the woman who used to call me her hero back when heroes were still a thing in our house. The message was short, sweet, and about as subtle as a brick through a window. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." I stared at that message for what felt like an hour, but was probably more like 30 seconds. Read it again and again, trying to find some hidden meaning, some context that would make it make sense. Because surely this was a joke, right? Some kind of miscommunication. Maybe she meant to send it to someone else. Her yoga instructor who kept hitting on her. The contractor who'd been fixing our kitchen cabinets for 3 months. But deep down in that part of your gut that knows things before your brain catches up, I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was the kind of message you send when you've been planning something for a while and you finally worked up the nerve to pull the trigger. A minute later, and I'm talking exactly 60 seconds, because when your life is imploding, you start paying attention to details like that. Another message came through. Not words this time. A photo. Our kids' suitcases lined up by our front door like little soldiers ready for deployment. Jax's beat-up Spider-Man rolling bag that he insisted on dragging everywhere, even to the grocery store. Ma's pink princess case that she decorated with stickers from every vacation we'd ever taken as a family. That's when the coffee mug slipped out of my hand. I didn't throw it. I didn't slam it down in some fit of masculine rage. I just let go and it shattered on the hotel room floor, sending terrible coffee and ceramic shards across the beige carpet that probably cost more per square foot than most people's rent. The sound was surprisingly loud in the silence of that sterile room. Then for a second, I just stood there staring at the mess, thinking that this was probably the perfect metaphor for whatever the hell was happening to my life. I called her 3 times, straight to voicemail each time, which meant she was either dead, in jail, or actively ignoring me. Given the context, I was pretty sure it wasn't the first 2 options. 10 minutes later, again, I was keeping track of time like some kind of deranged court reporter. My phone buzzed with a DM from a private Instagram account I didn't recognize. No profile picture, no followers. The kind of anonymous account that people create when they want to drop bombs without taking responsibility for the fallout. The message contained a video, shaky phone camera work, clearly shot from inside a car, or maybe behind some bushes like a discount private investigator. But the subject matter was crystal clear. My wife, Sabrina Pierce, carrying cardboard boxes into the lobby of an upscale condo building. And not just any condo building. I recognized those glass doors, that pretentious modern architecture that screamed, "I have more money than taste." It was Trent Mallory's place. Trent Billady Mallory, the golden boy entrepreneur with the perfect teeth and the startup that was going to revolutionize American logistics. The guy I was literally in Seattle to help secure a $500 million investment from our consortium. The same Trent who'd been having strategy dinners with my wife for the past few months, supposedly mentoring her through her MBA program. Apparently, he'd been mentoring her through a lot more than coursework. I watched that video 3 times, each viewing making me feel progressively more like an idiot. There was my wife, the woman who'd spent the morning texting me about Ma's soccer practice and Jack's science project, hauling her life into another man's apartment while I was 800 meters away, probably analyzing spreadsheets and worrying about quarterly projections like some kind of corporate zombie. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through Harvard Business School and built a company from nothing, started cataloging facts. Timeline. She'd sent the space message at 4:47 p.m. Pacific. The video was time-stamped 4:52 p.m., which meant she'd already been moving out when she decided to blow up our marriage via text. Classy. Real classy. The emotional part of my brain, meanwhile, was busy cycling through the greatest hits of male betrayal. Rage, disbelief, humiliation, and that special kind of fury that comes from realizing you've been played by someone you trusted completely. But underneath all of that was something else, something colder and more calculating. Because here's the thing about being a CEO. You don't get to where I am by falling apart when things go sideways. You get there by staying calm when everyone else is losing their minds. By thinking 3 moves ahead when your opponents are still figuring out the rules of the game. And right now, while my personal life was busy turning into a dumpster fire, my professional brain was already working the angles. I opened my laptop and pulled up Trent's funding proposal. $500 million. My consortium was the lead investor, which meant my signature was the difference between his startup becoming the next big thing or becoming another cautionary tale about entrepreneurs who confused ambition with ability. I scrolled through the documents, looking at all those projected revenue numbers and market analysis charts that painted such a pretty picture of his company's future. Then I opened my phone and typed a response to Sabrina's original message. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would sound crazy if it ended up being read aloud in a divorce proceeding. Just a simple, factual statement. Of course, tell your lover I'll cancel my $500 million investor check. I stared at that message for a long moment before hitting send. It was the kind of text that couldn't be taken back. The kind of move that would have consequences rippling out in directions I probably couldn't even imagine yet. But sometimes in life, you reach a point where the only thing left to do is stop pretending everything's fine and start dealing with reality. The message showed as delivered immediately. Then about 30 seconds later, it showed as read, and then nothing. No immediate response, no phone call, no panicked backpedaling. Just silence from the woman who'd been sharing my bed for 6 years, and apparently sharing a lot more with someone else. I sat down on the hotel room's ridiculously expensive chair and opened my laptop again. This time I wasn't looking at Trent's funding proposal. I was logging into our consortium's secure investment dashboard, the digital nerve center, where we moved amounts of money that most people couldn't even conceptualize. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of practice navigating through security protocols and authorization screens, until I reached the wire transfer controls. Aurelius Sovereign Partners $200 million commitment. Status pending final authorization. I clicked pause pending review. Keystone Strategic, $150 million side letter. Conditional funding based on lead investor participation. I sent a brief message to their managing director. Northbridge withdrawing from Trent Mallory opportunity. Recommend immediate reconsideration of participation. Stonefield Pension Fund, $100 million. They always followed our lead on infrastructure plays. I didn't need to contact them directly. They pull out the moment they heard we were stepping back. By midnight Seattle time, my phone was buzzing with messages from confused fund managers and panicked board members. The domino effect was beautiful in its simplicity. Without our consortium's backing, Trent's grand plans for logistics domination were about as valuable as a chocolate teapot. I ignored the calls and watched the dashboard update in real time. Paused, rescinded, under review. Each status change was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, except this house was made of other people's dreams and my wife's poor life choices. The Seattle rain kept falling outside my window, and somewhere across the country, a woman who'd asked for space was probably discovering that space could be a very expensive place to live. Somewhere else, a smooth-talking entrepreneur was learning that confidence and charm don't mean much when the money disappears. And me? I was sitting in an overpriced hotel room surrounded by broken coffee mug pieces, watching my marriage end in a $500 million deal evaporate, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Because sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the thing that finally sets you free. Let me take you back 6 years. Back when I was still naive enough to believe that love and money could coexist without one eventually corrupting the other. Back when I thought being the provider was the same thing as being the hero. Back when I was Logan Pierce, the generous husband, the guy who solved every problem with his checkbook and felt like a goddamn superhero every time he did it. Picture this. I'm 30 years old, fresh off the biggest deal of my career, standing in our cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like the neighbor's cooking and had a bathroom the size of a phone booth. Sabrina is sitting at our second-hand kitchen table, the one we bought from some college kid on Craigslist, surrounded by acceptance letters and financial aid forms like she's conducting some kind of academic orchestra. She'd gotten into Kinsley School of Management. Not Harvard or Wharton, but still a respectable MBA program that cost about as much as a luxury car. "Baby," she said, looking up at me with those eyes that used to make me forget my own name. "I know it's expensive, but this could change everything for us. You. Us. That word used to mean something different back then. It used to mean partnership, shared dreams, building something together. It didn't yet mean me fronting the cash while you collect the benefits. I didn't even hesitate. I was making serious money for the first time in my life. Northbridge Infrastructure Group was just starting to take off, and I was drunk on the possibility of never having to check my bank balance before buying groceries. "Don't worry about it," I told her, pulling out my laptop to transfer the tuition money. "Consider it an investment in our future." And Jesus Christ, was that the understatement of the century? See, here's what nobody tells you about growing up poor. When you finally start making real money, you get this almost manic need to prove that those days are over. I grew up with a single mom who counted coins before going to the grocery store, who made me understand from a very early age that money wasn't just money. It was security, dignity, options, hope. Mom used to say that being broke wasn't just about having empty pockets. It was about having your choices made for you by people who had more than you did. So when I finally had enough to make choices, I went a little crazy with it. Okay, maybe more than a little. I became the kind of guy who picked up every check, who insisted on paying for everything, who genuinely believed that financial generosity was the same thing as love. I was like some kind of benevolent dictator of our household economy. And for a while there, everyone seemed pretty happy with the arrangement. The apartment upgrade came first. We went from that cramped place with the neighbors who apparently cooked fish every single night to a decent 2-bedroom in a building that had actual amenities. Central air and unit laundry, a doorman who called me Mr. Pierce like I was somebody important. Sabrina loved it. She'd invite friends over just to show off the kitchen island, like having counter space was some kind of personal achievement. Then came the townhome, because apparently having a doorman wasn't enough. We needed a garage and a backyard, and one of those front porches where you could pretend to be the kind of people who waved at their neighbors and knew everyone's kids' names. The mortgage was steep, but I was pulling down serious money by then, and the look on Sabrina's face when she saw that house for the first time was worth every penny. She actually cried. Happy tears, the kind that made me feel like I could conquer the world with my credit score. But the real masterpiece, the crown jewel of my newfound financial prowess, was the lake house. And when I say lake house, I don't mean some rustic cabin where you rough it for the weekend. I'm talking about a legitimate waterfront property with a private dock, 5 bedrooms, and windows that looked out over Lake Washington like we were living inside a screensaver. The kind of place that real estate agents describe as a rare opportunity and priced like they're selling pieces of the moon. I bought it through Pierce Harbor LLC, my lawyer's idea, something about asset protection and tax benefits that sounded smart at the time. Sabrina spent 3 months decorating it like she was auditioning for some home design show. Professional staging, custom furniture, art from galleries whose names I couldn't pronounce. Every weekend became a house party with Sabrina playing hostess to an endless parade of her business school friends and their perfectly manicured lives. And the kids, God, the kids were everything. Jax was 3 when I bought that house, still small enough to think his dad was basically Superman. Mila was barely 1, all chubby cheeks and baby babble, the kind of kid who made strangers smile in grocery stores. I wanted them to grow up different than I did. I wanted them to never know what it felt like to want something and not be able to have it because money was tight. So, when it came time for school, public education wasn't even a conversation. Jax went to Riverside Preparatory Academy, the kind of private school where the parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership and the tuition cost more than most people's annual salary. Mila followed him there 2 years later. Field trips to museums, small class sizes, teachers who actually gave a damn about whether kids were learning the works. The cars came next. Sabrina's old Honda Civic was fine for a struggling young couple, but it didn't exactly scream successful executive's wife when she pulled up to school pickup or business school networking events. So, we upgraded, first to a nice sedan, then to an SUV when Mila started soccer, and we needed room for equipment and carpools. Both cars went in Sabrina's name. Something about insurance rates and her clean driving record. But I covered the payments, the insurance, the maintenance, even the gas. Hell, I probably could have bought stock in ExxonMobil with the amount I was spending at gas stations. And here's the thing that I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I loved it. Every payment, every upgrade, every expense report that made our accountant's eyes go wide. I love being the guy who could solve problems with money. Kid needs tutoring? Done. Wife wants to take a weekend trip with her girlfriends? No problem. Family vacation to Hawaii? Already booked. Sabrina used to call me her hero. She'd wrap her arms around me when I handed her a credit card for some shopping expedition or transferred money for another one of her investments in our future. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," she'd whisper, and I'd feel like I was 10 feet tall. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. It was subtle at first, the kind of change that happens so gradually you don't notice it until you're looking back and wondering how the hell you got here. The gratitude started feeling more like expectation. The appreciation began to sound more like entitlement. The thank you messages got shorter and less frequent until they disappeared altogether. "It's just easier if you handle it," became Sabrina's favorite phrase. Bills would appear on my desk with designer store receipts paperclipped on top like some kind of passive-aggressive art project. The conversation wasn't, "Can we afford this anymore?" It was, "I already bought it, so just take care of it." And like an idiot, I did. Every time the late-night strategy meeting started during her second year of business school, Sabrina would come home from these networking events glowing with excitement about some new connection or opportunity, usually involving Trent Mallory and his revolutionary approach to supply chain management. "He's incredibly smart," she'd say, scrolling through her phone while I cleared the dinner dishes. "He really gets the big picture." I told myself I wasn't jealous. Successful people network. That's how business works. The fact that these networking sessions seemed to happen exclusively with one particular entrepreneur who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate headshot was just a coincidence. The fact that she started dressing differently for these meetings, better jewelry, more expensive perfume, outfits that cost more than my first car, was just professional development. I told myself a lot of things back then. The truth is, I was so busy playing the role of the generous provider that I stopped paying attention to what was actually happening in my own house. I was so focused on being the guy who could afford anything that I forgot to ask whether the people I was buying things for actually wanted to be there with me, or whether they just wanted access to my bank account. I kept telling myself that love was trust, that real partnerships meant not keeping score, not questioning every expense, not demanding receipts for affection. I convinced myself that my paranoia about Trent was just garden-variety male insecurity, the kind of caveman jealousy that successful, enlightened men were supposed to rise above. Looking back now, from the wreckage of that Seattle hotel room, I can see how perfectly I'd been played. How every upgrade, every payment, every generous gesture had been building toward this moment. I'd been so busy funding everyone else's happiness that I'd forgotten to ask whether any of it was real. But here's what's really twisted about the whole situation. Even as I stood there staring at that video of my wife moving into another man's apartment, part of me was still doing the math, still calculating how much this was all going to cost me. The divorce lawyer fees, the custody arrangements, the split of assets that I'd spent 6 years accumulating. Because when you've been the family ATM for long enough, it becomes hard to think about relationships in any terms other than financial ones. Every memory gets a price tag. Every moment of happiness comes with a receipt. The Seattle rain kept falling outside my window, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become the kind of man who measured love in dollars and cents. The kind of man who thought he could buy loyalty and trust and happily ever after. Turns out you can't. But you can sure as hell stop funding the performance. 2 months before my life imploded in that Seattle hotel room, I threw what I thought was going to be a nice little dinner party at the lake house. You know, one of those intimate gatherings where successful people eat expensive food and pretend to have deep conversations about the future of American business. The kind of evening that ends with everyone feeling sophisticated and important, like they've just participated in something meaningful, instead of just consuming overpriced wine and making small talk. I should have known something was off when Sabrina spent 3 days planning the menu like she was catering a state dinner. We're talking multiple trips to Whole Foods, consultations with the wine guy at Metropolitan Market, and enough prep work to feed a small army for 8 people. 8 people who were supposedly just coming over for a casual evening among friends. But Sabrina was in her element, flitting around our kitchen like some kind of domestic goddess, wearing this little black dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and talking non-stop about how important it was to make the right impression. "These aren't just our friends, Logan," she kept saying, adjusting the flowers for the 3rd time in an hour. "These are our network, our future." Our future, right? The guest list was a carefully curated selection of Sabrina's business school crowd, plus a few of my colleagues and their wives. Nothing too crazy, just the kind of people who could afford to live on Lake Washington and had opinions about which restaurants were worth the drive into the city. The usual suspects from our social circle. People who measured success by the thread count of their sheets and the vintage of their wine. And then there was Trent Mallory. Trent showed up fashionably late, of course, because guys like Trent always make an entrance. He walked into my house that I bought with my money, like he owned the place. All confident strides and perfect smile, wearing one of those expensive casual blazers that somehow managed to look both relaxed and important at the same time. The kind of outfit that whispered, "I'm successful, but approachable," in the most obnoxious way possible. "Logan," he said, extending his hand like we were old friends instead of recent acquaintances. "Amazing place you've got here. Really captures the Pacific Northwest aesthetic." The Pacific Northwest aesthetic. This guy was talking about my home like it was a design choice instead of the place where my kids learned to ride bikes. And my wife used to tell me she loved me. But I smiled and shook his hand and played the gracious host, because that's what you do when you're trying to be the bigger person. Dinner started out normal enough. Good food, decent conversation. The usual mix of shop talk and social pleasantries that happens when business people get together outside the office. We talked about the election, about whether the Seahawks had any shot at a decent season, about the new Thai place that had opened downtown, standard dinner party fare. But I started noticing things. Little things that probably wouldn't have registered if I hadn't been paying attention. But that added up to a picture I really didn't want to see. Like how Sabrina laughed at Trent's jokes, not just polite dinner party laughter. I'm talking about full-throated, throw-your-head-back, tears-in-your-eyes kind of laughter at jokes that weren't even that funny. Trent would say something mildly amusing about airline food or traffic patterns. And Sabrina would react like he just delivered the comedic performance of the century. She introduced him to our other guests as the future of American logistics, like he was some kind of visionary, instead of just another startup founder with a PowerPoint deck and a dream. She hung on his every word when he talked about his company's plans to revolutionize supply chain management, nodding along like she actually understood the technical details instead of just being impressed by his confidence. And Trent, for his part, was eating it up. He spent most of the evening holding court at our dining room table, bragging about his startup's burn rate like it was some kind of badge of honor. "We're moving fast and breaking things," he kept saying, apparently unaware that this was a Facebook motto from about 15 years ago, and not an original thought. When you're disrupting an entire industry, you can't be afraid to spend money. Easy to say when it's not your money you're spending, right? He talked about his team like they were special forces operators instead of software engineers and logistics coordinators. He name-dropped investors who'd supposedly expressed interest in his company, though I noticed he was vague about specifics like actual dollar amounts and firm commitments. He mentioned partnerships with major players in the shipping industry without ever saying who these major players actually were. But the thing that really got to me was watching Sabrina's reaction to all this corporate theater. Every time Trent spoke, she'd touch the rim of her wine glass with her index finger. This little unconscious gesture that I'd never seen her do before. It was like she was keeping time to some private rhythm, marking the beats of his performance. I found myself counting those touches. One when he talked about scaling rapidly in Q3. Another when he mentioned his strategic partnerships with port authorities. 3 more during his speech about revolutionizing last-mile delivery. It was like she was conducting his bullshit symphony with her fingertip. Omar Reyes, my COO and one of the few people in the world who's never afraid to tell me the truth, was sitting next to me through all of this corporate peacocking. Omar's got this poker face that he's perfected over years of sitting through investor meetings and board presentations. But I could tell he was seeing the same things I was seeing. The way Sabrina kept finding excuses to walk past Trent's chair, the way she laughed just a little too loud, smiled just a little too bright, paid just a little too much attention to everything he said. After dinner, while everyone was milling around the living room with their coffee and after-dinner drinks, Omar pulled me aside. We stepped out onto the deck, where the lake stretched out in front of us like a black mirror, reflecting the lights from the houses on the opposite shore. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest evenings, the kind that makes you feel like you're living inside a postcard. "Logan," Omar said quietly, his voice careful and measured the way it got when he was about to say something I probably didn't want to hear. "Your money is funding everyone's performance but yours." That hit me like a slap across the face, mainly because it was true. I looked back through the sliding glass doors at my own dinner party, watching my wife animated and engaged in a way I hadn't seen in months, and realized that I'd become the backstage guy, the producer, the investor, the guy who paid for the lights and the sound system while someone else took center stage and soaked up all the applause. Inside, Trent was telling some story about a business trip to Singapore, gesturing with his hands like he was conducting an orchestra. Sabrina was hanging on every word, asking follow-up questions, genuinely engaged in a way that made me realize how long it had been since she'd looked at me like that. When was the last time she'd been excited to hear about my day? When was the last time she'd asked about my deals, my challenges, my victories? I couldn't remember. The other guests were starting to leave, making those polite dinner party noises about what a wonderful evening it had been, and how we absolutely must do this again soon. But Trent lingered. He always lingered. He helped Sabrina clear the dishes like he lived there, complimented the wine selection like he'd personally curated it, made himself comfortable in my living room like he was auditioning for the role of replacement husband. "You've really built something special here, Logan," he said, as he finally prepared to leave, gesturing around the house like he was appraising it for purchase. Sabrina is lucky to have someone who can provide all this. Provide. That's what I was to him. Not a partner, not a husband, not even really a person, just a provider. A walking, talking ATM machine with good credit and poor judgment. After everyone left, I helped Sabrina finish cleaning up, stacking plates, and wiping down counters while she chattered about what a successful evening it had been. Everyone had such a good time, she said, practically glowing with satisfaction. And Trent is just so inspiring, don't you think? The way he talks about building something that really matters. I nodded and made appropriate noises, but inside I was doing the math. The math on the dinner, probably $300 for groceries and wine. The math on the house, mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities, the math on everything that had made this evening possible, from the plates we ate on to the roof over our heads. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I started wondering what exactly I was getting in return for my investment. Because watching my wife laugh at another man's jokes in the house I'd bought her while wearing the dress I'd paid for, surrounded by the life I'd funded, I was starting to suspect that the return on investment wasn't quite what I'd been led to believe. That night, after Sabrina fell asleep, I stood on our deck looking out over the lake, listening to the water lap against our private dock, and tried to figure out when exactly I'd stopped being a husband and started being a sponsor. When love had turned into a transaction. When my family had become a business where I was the sole investor and everyone else was collecting dividends. The answer I was beginning to realize was probably the moment I decided that money could buy happiness. Turns out it can, just not your own. So there I was, flying back from Seattle a day early like some kind of corporate refugee, staring out the airplane window at clouds that looked suspiciously like the emotional wreckage of my personal life. The flight attendant kept asking if I wanted another coffee, and I kept saying yes because what else was I going to do? Sit there stone-cold sober while processing the fact that my wife had just nuked our marriage via text message while moving in with the guy I was supposed to make rich. Yeah, I needed the caffeine. But here's the thing about being a CEO. You don't get to wallow. You don't get to lock yourself in your office with a bottle of whiskey and a box of tissues like some kind of heartbroken teenager. When your world goes sideways, you do what you always do. You call a meeting. You gather your people. You figure out the next move. And lucky for me, I had the right people. First call went to Rafi Khan, my best friend since college, and probably the only person on earth who's seen me ugly cry more than once and still takes my phone calls. Rafi runs Argent Atlas, this boutique operations consulting firm that specializes in making broken companies work. Again, he's got this genius-level understanding of systems and processes. The kind of brain that can look at a chaotic mess and immediately see the 3 or 4 pressure points that need to be adjusted to make everything run smoothly. We met at college during sophomore year when I was failing calculus, and he was tutoring half the business school for beer money. Rafi is the kind of guy who can explain quantum physics using pizza metaphors and somehow make it all make sense. He's also the kind of friend who will tell you when you're being an idiot, which is apparently exactly what I needed. Emergency meeting. I texted him from the plane. My life just went full Chernobyl. His response came back immediately. Conference room or whiskey bar? Conference room. This requires spreadsheets. Second call went to Dar saying, my family lawyer and the most intimidating 5'2" woman you'll ever meet. Dar has got this reputation in Seattle legal circles for being absolutely ruthless in family court. The kind of attorney who can smile politely while systematically dismantling your opponent's entire argument. She's handled my business contracts for years, and I'd been smart enough to have her draft our prenup back when Sabrina and I still believed in forever. Dra doesn't do emergency meetings. She does strategic consultations with predetermined objectives and measurable outcomes. When I called her from the airport, she was already 3 steps ahead. "Logan," she said before I could even explain the situation. "I assume this is about the Instagram video that's been circulating in certain professional circles. Apparently, I was the last to know about my own marital crisis." "Fantastic. How long have you known?" I asked. "Long enough to pull your prenup and start reviewing asset protection structures. Cancel whatever you're doing tomorrow and come to my office at 9. Bring coffee that doesn't taste like airport water." Third call went to Tessa Quinn, my CFO and the person who probably knows more about my financial life than I do. Tessa's got this supernatural ability to look at numbers and immediately spot patterns that would take normal humans hours to identify. She can smell financial irregularities from 3 states away, and she saved my ass more times than I can count by catching problems before they became disasters. "Tessa," I said when she picked up, "I need you to run a complete audit on every dollar that's touched Sabrina's name in the past 12 months. Personal or professional, everything. Credit cards, bank transfers, insurance payments, investment accounts. I want to know exactly how much money has been flowing from my accounts to fund her lifestyle." There was a pause. Then, "Logan, are we talking divorce-level audit or just curiosity?" "We're talking nuclear-level audit. I want receipts, dates, patterns, and a full breakdown of where every penny went. I'll have preliminary numbers by tomorrow afternoon." The 4th member of my inner circle was already waiting for me when I landed. Omar Reyes, my COO, and the closest thing I have to a work spouse. Omar has been with Northbridge since the early days, back when we were operating out of a shared office space and eating ramen noodles for lunch because that's all we could afford. He's seen me through every major crisis the company's faced, and he's got this supernatural ability to stay calm when everyone else is losing their minds. Omar picked me up at Seattle-Tacoma in his beat-up Honda Civic. The guy makes 6 figures and still drives the same car he had in grad school because he says luxury cars are just expensive ways to get from point A to point B. We drove straight to my office without talking about the elephant in the room because Omar understands that sometimes you need to sit with bad news for a minute before you start trying to fix it. The next morning, my war council convened in Northbridge's main conference room, the same room where I'd closed million-dollar deals and made decisions that affected hundreds of jobs and thousands of investors. Except today, instead of talking about infrastructure projects and quarterly projections, we were talking about the smoking crater that used to be my personal life. Rafi showed up with his laptop and enough energy drinks to power a small city. He'd already started building what he called the situation analysis, a comprehensive breakdown of every moving part in this mess. From the obvious stuff like divorce proceedings to the more complex issues like potential conflicts of interest with Trent's funding. "You're fighting on 2 fronts," he explained, pulling up a flowchart that looked like something NASA would use to plan a moon landing. "Heart and money. The emotional stuff is yours to handle. But the financial and legal strategy, that's what we're here for." Dee arrived with a folder thick enough to use as a weapon, containing every document that might be relevant to what was about to become the most expensive learning experience of my life. Prenup clauses that I'd forgotten existed, trust structures that protected the kids' education funds, power of attorney limits that prevented Sabrina from making major financial decisions without my approval, schooling stipends that were set up as direct payments to institutions rather than cash transfers. "Your past self was smarter than you gave him credit for," she said, spreading papers across the conference table like she was dealing cards in the world's most boring poker game. "Pice Harbor LLC owns the lake house, which means it's protected from personal liability. The kids' 529 plans are in your name only, and the prenup has some very interesting clauses about marital misconduct and misuse of confidential business information. Tessa's presentation was pure mathematics, the kind of brutal honesty that only numbers can provide. She'd created this color-coded dashboard that showed exactly where my money had been going for the past year. Sabrina's credit card charges organized by category and merchant. Cash transfers to her personal account plotted on a timeline that showed a steady increase over the past 6 months. Insurance payments, car maintenance, household expenses, subscription services. Every dollar that had flowed from my accounts to fund what I thought was our shared life. The numbers were staggering. Not because they were huge, I could afford it all, obviously, but because they painted such a clear picture of how completely one-sided our financial relationship had become. I was funding everything, and I mean everything, from her morning Starbucks runs to her weekend spa appointments. Meanwhile, her own income from a part-time consulting gig was apparently being saved in an account I'd never even known existed. She's been building an exit fund, Tessa said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing quarterly revenue projections instead of my wife's secret financial planning. Small amounts, but consistent. Someone who understands money management was advising her. We all looked at each other. Trent, presumably the guy who talked a big game about disrupting industries, was apparently pretty good at disrupting marriages, too. Omar, who'd been quietly taking notes throughout all of this, finally spoke up. So, what's the play? That's when Rafi leaned back in his chair with this expression that I'd seen before back in college when he was about to solve some impossible problem that had been driving everyone else crazy. It was the look of a guy who just figured out how to win a game that everyone else thought was unwinnable. We don't fight, he said. We don't argue. We don't make threats or demands or dramatic gestures. We just stopped funding the performance. He pulled up a new screen on his laptop. This clean, simple project management interface that he'd apparently been building while the rest of us were sharing our feelings. Project Clean Cut, he announced, like he was unveiling the latest iPhone. Phase 1. Remove financial support without creating grounds for claims of abandonment or retaliation. Phase 2. Document everything. Phase 3. Let natural consequences teach lessons we're not allowed to teach directly. Dar was already nodding along. Legally, this works. You're not required to maintain lifestyle support for an arranged spouse, especially when there's evidence of misconduct. The kids' needs continue to be met directly, which protects you from abandonment claims. Tessa started pulling up account access screens. I can have the financial infrastructure changes implemented within 24 hours. Clean cuts, all documented, all reversible if needed. And that's when I realized that despite feeling like my world was falling apart, I was actually surrounded by exactly the right people for this situation. Rafi, who could engineer solutions to problems that didn't even exist yet. Dra, who could navigate legal minefields while wearing heels and somehow make it look easy. Tessa, who could make numbers tell stories that would hold up in court. Omar, who could manage the business side of things while I dealt with the personal fallout. These weren't just my employees or my professional contacts. These were my real allies. The people who showed up when things got ugly, who offered solutions instead of sympathy, who understood that sometimes the best way to handle betrayal is with precision rather than passion. All right, I said, looking around the table at these 4 people who just volunteered to help me navigate the worst situation of my adult life. Let's see how much space Sabrina really wants. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from 6 years of marriage and 15 years of business, it's that people rarely think through the full implications of what they're asking for. They want the benefits without the costs, the freedom without the responsibility, the space without the consequences. Time to give my wife exactly what she'd requested with all the fine print attached. The beauty of having a team of professionals who actually know what they're doing is that they can turn your emotional meltdown into a surgical operation. No drama, no screaming matches, no throwing dishes or changing locks like some kind of daytime TV divorce special. Just clean, precise moves that would make a chess grandmaster weep with joy. Rafi's plan was elegant in its simplicity. We weren't going to attack anything directly. We were just going to stop subsidizing Sabrina's performance. No grand gestures, no angry confrontations, no ultimatums delivered through gritted teeth. We were simply going to let mathematics teach the lessons that I'd apparently been too stupid to teach myself over the past 6 years. Think of it like turning off the power to a movie set, Rafi explained as we sat in my office the next morning, surrounded by enough coffee cups to caffeinate a small army. The actors can keep performing, but eventually everyone's going to notice that the lights aren't working anymore. First up, the phones. Now, this might sound petty, but hear me out. Sabrina and the kids were all on my corporate family plan, which meant unlimited everything. Data, international calling, premium streaming services, the works. The kind of phone service that costs more per month than most people spend on groceries. Sabrina had been using her phone like it was a personal entertainment system, streaming Netflix during her yoga classes and FaceTiming with her business school friends for hours at a time. Tessa handled the transition with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She ported Jack's and Ma's numbers to a temporary pay-as-you-go plan that I funded directly because I'm not a monster and kids shouldn't suffer for their parents' poor life choices. But Sabrina's line that got transferred to her own individual plan, her problem now. The beauty of this move was that it looked completely reasonable on paper. A strange spouse wants space. Fine. Handle your own phone bill. Kids need to stay in touch with both parents. Of course, their service continues uninterrupted. Any family court judge would see this as responsible financial boundary setting rather than vindictive punishment. Next came the credit cards. And oh boy, was this where things got interesting. See, what most people don't realize is that when you're married to someone with a corporate job, a lot of your joint financial infrastructure is actually tied to their employment benefits. Sabrina had been carrying around what she thought were our credit cards, but they were actually authorized user accounts on my corporate benefits package. American Express Platinum Corporate with its unlimited spending potential and concierge services. Chase Sapphire Reserve Business with the travel perks and purchase protection. Even stupid Nordstrom card that she used for her monthly shopping expeditions. All of them were technically extensions of my business accounts, which meant all of them could disappear faster than free samples at Costco. Tessa sent the cancellation requests on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Sabrina's wallet had transformed from a financial Swiss Army knife into a collection of useless plastic rectangles. The first sign of trouble probably came when she tried to buy her usual $20 acai bowl at that pretentious smoothie place near her gym and got the dreaded card decline message. But the real masterpiece was the car situation. Sabrina's SUV, the one she drove to school pickup like she was auditioning for Real Housewives of Lake Washington, was insured under my corporate fleet policy. It was one of those details that had seemed smart at the time, bundling everything together for better rates and simpler bookkeeping. The vehicle was registered in her name, sure, but the insurance that made it legal to drive was tied to my business accounts. Omar handled this one personally, calling our insurance agent and explaining that we needed to remove a vehicle from our fleet coverage due to changing employment circumstances. Completely true, completely legal, and completely devastating. Within 36 hours, Sabrina's SUV went from being a fully covered luxury vehicle to being an uninsured liability, sitting in Trent's condo parking garage. Washington State doesn't mess around with uninsured vehicles. The registration gets flagged automatically, which means cops can spot it from their patrol cars. And driving without insurance is the kind of violation that can turn a routine traffic stop into a very expensive day. Then came the service cancellations, and this is where Tesla's color-coded spreadsheet really started paying dividends. Turns out, when you've been the family ATM for 6 years, you accumulate a truly impressive collection of recurring charges. The housekeeping service that came twice a week to clean our townhome, the meal delivery subscription that brought organic, locally sourced dinners to our door 3 times a week, the spa membership that Sabrina used for her monthly self-care appointments, Netflix, Hulu, Spotify Premium, Amazon Prime, Peloton subscription, wine club membership, weekly flower delivery, premium gym membership at that place where they serve kombucha in the locker room. All of it connected to my accounts. All of it cancelable with a few clicks and phone calls. The gym cancellation was particularly satisfying. Sabrina's fitness club wasn't just expensive. It was the kind of place where membership was almost like a social status symbol. You couldn't just work out there. You had to be seen working out there, preferably in matching athletic wear that cost more than most people's car payments. Losing access to that particular temple of suburban excellence was going to hurt in ways that went far beyond just having to find a new place to do yoga. We moved through the list systematically, like surgeons removing tumors. Each cancellation was documented. Each termination was justified. Each cut was clean and professional. This wasn't emotional revenge. This was strategic resource reallocation. The rental property expenses were next. C. In addition to our primary residence, we'd been covering the rent on Sabrina's downtown apartment, supposedly a convenient place for her to crash between classes and networking events. I'd been paying $2,800 a month for what was essentially a very expensive hotel room that my wife used to avoid having to drive home from her affair. That lease was month to month, thankfully. Omar sent the notice of non-renewal, effective immediately. By Thursday evening, the infrastructure that had supported Sabrina's lifestyle for the past 6 years was systematically disappearing. No more unlimited phone data for her marathon FaceTime sessions. No more premium streaming services for her background noise. No more housekeeping service to maintain the townhome she'd abandoned. No more meal deliveries to feed the life she'd been building with someone else. That's when my phone finally rang. It was 10:22 p.m., and Sabrina's name appeared on my screen for the first time since the original disaster text. I let it ring 4 times before answering because even in crisis situations, it's important to maintain a little dignity. Logan. Her voice sounded different, smaller, less sure of itself than it had in months. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral, not angry, not hurt, just distant, professional. "Why can't my card run?" I tried to get gas and it was declined. And then I tried the backup card and that one didn't work either. I could hear background noise, television, maybe music, the sound of other people living their lives, while my wife called to complain about the consequences of her choices. "You asked for space," I said simply. "I'm giving you space." "That's not Logan. This is ridiculous. I need access to our accounts." "Our accounts." Interesting how quickly space became our when convenience was on the line. "I'll have my attorney send you contact information for establishing your own financial independence." I said, "Since that seems to be what you're looking for." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then finally, "Logan, we need to talk about this like adults." "We tried that." I said. "You chose texting instead." I hung up and immediately forwarded the call log to DRA because everything was evidence now. Every conversation, every interaction, every attempt at manipulation or reconciliation, all of it needed to be documented and filed away for the legal proceedings that were clearly coming. My phone buzzed with a text from Sabrina 5 minutes later. "This is crazy. You're being crazy. I screenshotted it and filed it away with the rest. Then I poured myself 3 fingers of the good whiskey I kept in my office for special occasions and toasted the empty room. Here's the space, I said to nobody in particular. May you get exactly as much as you asked for. Outside my office windows, Seattle glittered in the distance like a circuit board. All those lights representing lives and businesses and dreams that kept running because someone, somewhere, was handling the practical details, paying the bills, maintaining the infrastructure, keeping the lights on. I've been keeping a lot of lights on for a lot of people. Time to see how they did in the dark. While Sabrina was busy discovering that adultery doesn't come with a benefits package, I had bigger fish to fry. Specifically, I had a $500 million fish named Trent Mallory, who was about to learn that sleeping with an investor's wife might just be the worst business decision of his entrepreneurial career. Now, before you start thinking I'm some kind of vindictive bishop who uses business deals to settle personal scores, let me explain something about how venture capital actually works in the real world. It's not just about the money, though. Obviously, the money matters. It's about trust, reputation, and the kind of due diligence that can make or break companies before they even get off the ground. Trent needed our consortium's funding to close contracts with port authorities and rail vendors across the Pacific Northwest. Without that money, his grand vision of revolutionizing American logistics was about as viable as a chocolate teapot. But more than that, he needed my name on his pitch deck. See, when you've been in this business as long as I have, when you've successfully guided companies from startup to IPO and made investors stupid amounts of money in the process, your endorsement carries weight. Trent had been using my involvement as his primary selling point to other investors. Logan Pierce is leading the round. He'd tell potential backers like my participation was some kind of good housekeeping seal of approval for risky investments. My reputation was his security blanket, my track record was his credibility, and my network was his golden ticket to the big leagues. Funny how he forgot to mention that when he was playing house with my wife. The thing is, I actually had been planning to invest in his company. Before I found out he was investing in my marriage, his business model seemed solid enough, not revolutionary. Despite what he kept telling everyone at dinner parties, but competent, the kind of steady, unglamorous infrastructure play that makes money without making headlines. Port optimization, rail logistics, supply chain management. Boring, but profitable. But here's what happens when you mix personal betrayal with professional relationships. Suddenly, you start looking at everything with a lot more skepticism. You start asking the hard questions that you maybe should have been asking all along. You start wondering if the guy who's been lying to your face about sleeping with your wife might also be lying to your face about his quarterly projections. So, I asked Tessa to dig deeper. Not just the standard due diligence that we'd already completed, but the kind of forensic financial analysis that turns over every rock and examines every assumption. The kind of investigation that treats every claim like a potential fraud and every projection like a work of creative fiction. What she found was illuminating. Trent's company had been painting a very pretty picture for investors, but the reality underneath was messier than a toddler's art project. The revenue projections were based on pipeline deals that were a lot less certain than his pitch deck suggested. The client list included several companies that existed mostly on paper. The competitive analysis conveniently ignored some major players who were already doing exactly what Trent claimed to be revolutionizing. But the real kicker was buried in the vendor agreements. Turns out our boy Trent had been quietly consulting for Pacific Coastal Logistics, one of our biggest competitors, while simultaneously seeking investment for his own company that would directly compete with them. Not exactly illegal, but the kind of conflict of interest that makes institutional investors break out in hives. Tessa compiled everything into what she called a sober brief. 23 pages of financial reality that read like a coroner's report on Trent's business prospects. Overvalued KPIs that assumed growth rates that would make Amazon jealous. An inflated pipeline that counted preliminary conversations as confirmed contracts. A risky vendor concentration that put way too many eggs in way too few baskets. And then there was the little matter of Trent privately consulting for a competitor while seeking investment for a directly competing venture. The kind of detail that transforms promising startup into potential liability faster than you can say fiduciary responsibility. I didn't have to sabotage anything. I didn't have to make up problems or manufacture concerns. I just had to share the truth with the right people and let market forces do what market forces do best. Destroy companies that don't deserve to exist. The first call went to Marcus Chun at Aurelius Sovereign Partners. Marcus and I had worked together on infrastructure deals for almost a decade, and he trusted my judgment enough to move $200 million based on my recommendation. When I told him we needed to pause the wire for enhanced diligence, he didn't ask questions. He just made the call. Aurelius is placing investment on hold pending additional review, the message that landed in Trent's inbox at 2:47 p.m. on Friday. Keystone Strategic was next. Jennifer Walsh, their managing director, had already expressed some concerns about the timeline and capital requirements. When I sent her Tessa's brief along with a note that Northbridge was reconsidering participation due to newly discovered risk factors, she didn't waste time. Keystone withdrawing conditional commitment, effective immediately, went out an hour later. The domino effect was beautiful to watch. Stonefield Pension Fund had been planning to follow our lead. They always did on infrastructure plays, mainly because their investment committee was risk-averse enough to make actuaries look like adrenaline junkies. When they heard that both Aurelius and Keystone were backing out, they didn't even bother with a formal withdrawal. They just postponed their investment committee vote indefinitely, which in pension funds speak means hell no. By Friday evening, Trent's grand $500 million funding round had evaporated like morning mist. Without the institutional investors, the bridge loan from First National wouldn't extend. Without the bridge loan, payroll was going to bounce harder than a rubber ball in a concrete room. The first sign that Trent was starting to understand the scope of his problem came in the form of panicked emails to his board members. I know this because one of those board members, Richard Hang, happens to sit on the advisory board of a company I invested in last year. Professional circles in Seattle are smaller than most people realize. And when $500 million disappears overnight, word travels fast. Emergency board meeting called for Monday morning. Richard mentioned casually when he called about an unrelated matter, something about a funding gap that needs immediate attention. A funding gap. That's what they were calling it. Like Trent's company had developed a small crack that could be fixed with some financial spackle instead of the gaping chasm that it actually was. Saturday brought more entertainment. Tessa forwarded me an email chain that she'd intercepted through our corporate intelligence contacts. Apparently, Trent was reaching out to secondary investors, the kind of vulture funds that swoop in when primary deals fall apart and companies get desperate. The terms these bottom feeders were offering made payday loans look generous. Seeking immediate bridge funding to maintain operational continuity, read one particularly desperate message. Willing to discuss accelerated liquidation preferences and enhanced board representation. Translation: please give us money. We'll give you control of the company, and we promised not to ask too many questions about why our original investors bailed. The weekend was also when Trent's vendor relationship started showing stress fractures. Major suppliers who'd been operating on net 30 payment terms suddenly wanted cash on delivery. The Port Authority contracts that were supposed to be locked up started developing complications. Nothing dramatic, nothing actionable, just the kind of business friction that happens when word gets around that a company might not be as financially stable as it appears. By Sunday evening, I was sitting in my home office working through quarterly projections for my actual business, the one that wasn't falling apart because its founder couldn't keep his hands to himself, when my phone lit up with notifications, a screenshot from an unknown number. The image showed Trent in what looked like a conference room, surrounded by papers and laptops, sweat stains visible on his white shirt despite the fact that it was probably 70 degrees in that room. On the wall-mounted screen, I could see faces of board members and legal counsel dialed in for what was clearly an emergency damage control session. The subject line of the screenshot was simple and devastating. Urgent. Funding gap analysis. I saved the image to my phone and forwarded it to Rafi with a message, "Progress report." His response came back immediately. Beautiful, clean, surgical. The thing about consequences is that they don't care about your intentions or your feelings or your elaborate justifications for bad behavior. They just care about cause and effect. Trent had caused a situation by sleeping with an investor's wife. The effect was that the investor stopped investing. Everything else, the canceled funding, the panicked board meetings, the sweat stains on expensive shirts, was just math working itself out. At 11:47 p.m., my phone buzzed one more time. Another screenshot from that same unknown number, this one showing a different angle of the same conference room. Trent was standing now, hands pressed against the table, looking like a man who just realized that actions have consequences, and consequences don't care about your startup dreams. The timestamp on the image showed it had been taken just a few minutes earlier, which meant someone was documenting this meltdown in real time. Someone with access to Trent's inner circle. Someone who wanted me to see exactly how much damage my withdrawal was causing. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a pretty good idea who might be sending these updates. In my experience, when companies start imploding, there's always someone on the inside who sees the writing on the wall and starts looking for the exit. Smart employees don't go down with sinking ships, especially when they have families to feed and mortgages to pay. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and headed upstairs to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring more consequences, more financial reality checks, more lessons in cause and effect. But for tonight, I was content to know that somewhere across town, a smooth-talking entrepreneur was learning that confidence and charm don't mean much when the money disappears. And somewhere else, a woman who'd asked for space was discovering that space could be a very expensive place to live. I slept like a baby. You know what's funny about people who think they're playing chess when they're actually playing checkers? They always overplay their hand. They always push too hard, too fast, thinking that bigger moves equal better strategy. Sabrina was about to learn this lesson the hard way. The morning after her panicked phone call about the credit cards, I woke up to a text message that made my blood pressure spike higher than a SpaceX rocket. It was long, like novel-length long. The kind of message that people write when they're trying to justify the unjustifiable with sheer volume of words. Logan, I know you're hurt, but what you're doing is vindictive and childish. The kids are staying with me. You're clearly not in a stable emotional state to be around them right now. I think it's best if you don't see Jax and Mila until you can get your anger under control and start acting like a responsible adult instead of a scorned teenager. I read that message 3 times, each reading making me progressively more furious. Not because she was trying to hurt me. I'd already accepted that ship had sailed when she decided to redecorate Trent's condo with our family photos. No, I was pissed because she was trying to use my kids as weapons in a war that she'd started. See, there are rules to this kind of thing. Unwritten rules, maybe, but rules nonetheless. You can blow up your marriage if you want. You can move in with some smooth-talking entrepreneur and pretend you're living in a romantic comedy instead of a cautionary tale. You can even try to take half of everything I've worked for in the divorce settlement. But you don't mess with the kids. You don't use 9-year-old Jax and 7-year-old Mila as pawns in your adult games. You don't try to turn them against their father because you're mad that your credit cards got canceled. That, bish ends now. I forwarded Sabrina's message to Dra along with a note. She just made this a custody fight. Please respond appropriately. What came back an hour later was a masterpiece of legal precision. The kind of response that sounds polite and reasonable while simultaneously destroying every argument your opponent thought they had. Dra had this gift for writing messages that could be read aloud in family court without making you sound like a vindictive asshole, even when you were feeling exactly like a vindictive asshole. The message was sent from my email but written entirely in Dar's voice, calm, factual, and absolutely devastating. Sabrina, I understand you have concerns about the children's welfare during this difficult time. Please know that their well-being remains my top priority to ensure continuity of care. 1. I will continue paying Jack and Ma's school fees directly to Riverside Preparatory Academy, as well as any additional educational expenses, including tutoring, field trips, and extracurricular activities. 2. I will maintain their health, dental, and vision insurance coverage under my corporate plan, with no interruption of service. 3. I will pick up Jax and Mila every Saturday at 10 a.m. and return them every Sunday at 6 p.m. until formal custody arrangements are established through proper legal channels. 4. All communication regarding the children's schedules, medical needs, or school matters should go through my attorney, Darush Singh, whose contact information is attached. I look forward to establishing a formal parenting plan that puts Jax and Mila's needs first. Best regards, Logan. The beauty of this response was that it looked completely reasonable while being absolutely infuriating. I wasn't fighting for custody. I was simply stating what was already going to happen. I wasn't making demands. I was just clarifying the new reality. And most importantly, I wasn't letting emotion drive the conversation, just facts, schedules, and legal procedures. Sabrina's response came back within the hour. You can't just dictate custody arrangements. Dar's reply. You're absolutely right. That's why we'll be filing for temporary custody orders through King County Family Court. My office will handle all documentation. Game, set, match. But here's the thing about being a dad. None of this legal maneuvering meant anything if I couldn't look my kids in the eye and know that I was doing right by them. Jax and Mila didn't ask for their parents to turn into the kind of people who communicate through lawyers and fight over pickup schedules. They just wanted their mom and dad to figure out how to be grown-ups. Saturday morning came faster than I expected. I drove to the townhome, our old townhome, the one I'd bought because Sabrina wanted a yard for the kids and a garage for her car. Feeling like I was picking up my children from strangers. The house looked different somehow, like something fundamental had shifted in the 2 weeks since Sabrina had moved out. The lawn needed cutting. There were newspapers piled up by the front door, and the flower beds that Sabrina used to obsess over were already looking neglected. Jax answered the door wearing his favorite Seahawks jersey, and that serious expression he gets when he's trying to figure out adult problems with his 9-year-old brain. Milo was right behind him, clutching her stuffed elephant like it was a life preserver. "Hey guys," I said, kneeling down to their level. Ready for some dad time? Are you and Mom getting divorced? Jax asked. Because 9-year-olds have this supernatural ability to cut straight through bitch and ask the questions that adults spend hours dancing around. I looked at my son, this kid who'd inherited my stubbornness and his mother's intelligence, and decided that he deserved an honest answer. Yeah, buddy, we are. Is it because of Trent? Mila piped up, proving that 7-year-olds are apparently FBI agents in training. Jesus Christ, how much did they know? How much had they seen? How long had they been watching their parents' marriage fall apart while I was busy playing the oblivious provider? It's complicated, I said, which is what adults always say when they don't want to explain that sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to love most. We drove to Nana Rose's, this little Italian place that had been our family tradition since before Mila could walk. The kind of restaurant where they know your order before you sit down, and the owner asks about your kids by name. Real family atmosphere. The kind that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Jax ordered his usual pepperoni pizza, extra cheese. Mila got her chicken tenders with honey mustard, even though we all knew she was going to eat maybe 3 bites before declaring herself full. I ordered a beer and tried to figure out how to have a conversation with my children about the fact that their family was falling apart, without traumatizing them for life. Dad, Mila said between bites of chicken tender, are we still a team? That question hit me harder than any divorce lawyer's letter or any screenshot of my wife moving into another man's apartment. Because that's what we'd always been. What I'd thought we were building all those years. Team Pierce, the 4 of us against the world, working together, supporting each other, building something that would last. Always, I told her, reaching across the table to squeeze her little hand. No matter what happens between Mom and me, you and Jax and I will always be a team. Jax looked up from his pizza, cheese stretching between the slice and his mouth. Even if we have to live in different houses. Even then, that's when he slipped his hand into mine, his fingers still greasy from pizza, but warm and solid and real. That touch was like pure oxygen after weeks of feeling like I was suffocating. These kids, my kids, they were the only things in this whole mess that mattered. Everything else was just money and property and hurt feelings. But Jax and Mila were the actual treasures worth fighting for. We spent the rest of lunch talking about normal stuff. Jax's upcoming science fair project about volcanoes, Mila's soccer team, and whether they had a shot at winning their division. The new Star Wars movie that we were planning to see together. Regular dad and kids conversation. The kind that reminded me why I'd worked so hard to build a life worth living in the first place. On the drive home, Jax asked if we could still do our regular Saturday morning pancakes, and Mila wanted to know if she could still sleep in my bed when she had nightmares. These were the questions that mattered. Not who got the lake house or how the assets would be divided, but whether their dad would still be their dad when the legal dust settled. Absolutely, I told them both. Some things are never going to change. When I dropped them off at the townhome Sunday evening, Sabrina was waiting by the door looking like she'd spent the weekend crying and stress-eating. Her eyes were red. Her hair was pulled back in that messy bun that meant she'd given up trying to look put together. And she was wearing sweatpants that had seen better decades. Logan, she started like she was going to try to have some kind of emotional conversation right there on the front porch. Pickup is 10 a.m. next Saturday, I said calmly, kissing both kids goodbye. Oop is 6 p.m. Sunday. If there are any schedule changes needed, contact Dar's office. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't engage with whatever manipulation or guilt trip she had prepared. I just got in my car and drove away. Because the only thing worse than having your marriage destroyed by text message is letting your ex-wife turn your children into weapons in a war they didn't start. That night, alone in the lake house that suddenly felt way too big and way too quiet, I made myself a promise. I could lose the wife, the marriage, even half my assets if it came to that. But I wasn't going to lose my kids. I wasn't going to let them become casualties in Sabrina's quest for space and Trent's quest for funding. Some things were non-negotiable. Some things were worth fighting for. And some things, like being a father to Jackson Mila, were more important than winning. When you're dealing with someone who thinks they're smarter than they actually are, the best strategy is usually just giving them enough rope to hang themselves. And holy shit, had Sabrina and Trent been busy weaving that rope for months without even realizing it. Raffi showed up to the office Monday morning looking like he'd spent the weekend drinking espresso and snorting Adderall, surrounded by enough printouts and digital files to stock a small library. The guy had gone full forensic accountant on my marriage, building what he called the Ledger of Truth, a comprehensive timeline of every lie, every betrayal, and every stupid decision that had led us to this point. "You're going to love this," he said, spreading documents across my conference table like he was dealing cards in the world's most depressing poker game. "Your wife and her boyfriend apparently never heard of operational security. First up, the calendar overlaps." Tessa had pulled Sabrina's schedule from our shared Google Calendar, the one we'd set up years ago so we could coordinate kid pickups and family obligations, and cross-referenced it with the dates of our marriage counseling sessions. Because, yeah, we've been going to counseling. 3 months of sitting in Dr. Rebecca Martinez's office talking about communication issues and growing apart and finding ways to reconnect. Turns out, Sabrina had been finding ways to reconnect. "All right, just not with me. Look at this pattern," Raffi said, pointing to a spreadsheet that made my stomach drop. March 15th, counseling session at 6 p.m. Sabrina's calendar shows strategy dinner with Trent at 8 p.m. March 22nd, counseling at 6 p.m. Dinner with Trent at 8:30. April 5th, same thing. She'd been going straight from marriage counseling to dinner dates with her future replacement. While I was sitting in that therapist's office, earnestly discussing how we could improve our relationship, Sabrina was already planning her exit strategy over appetizers and wine with another man. The level of calculation involved was almost impressive. Almost. But the real smoking gun came from their text messages. Not the recent ones. Those had probably been deleted faster than a politician's embarrassing tweets. I'm talking about the old messages, the ones from 3 months ago when they thought they were being careful and clever. Tessa had pulled phone records that showed message timestamps between Sabrina's number and Trent's number, cross-referenced with location data and payment records. The pattern was clearer than a neon sign in Times Square. Messages about keeping it quiet until funding lands. Screenshots of my internal investor notes forwarded to Trent at 2:11 a.m. Like some kind of midnight intelligence briefing. A Venmo transaction from Trent to Sabrina with a memo for the condo key fob. A key fob. He'd literally paid her for access to his apartment, and they'd been dumb enough to leave a paper trail. "This isn't just adultery," Dar said, reviewing the evidence with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. "This is potential trade secret violation. Those investor notes contain confidential information that could affect stock prices and deal negotiations." She was right. The documents Sabrina had been forwarding to Trent included sensitive information about our investment strategies, our assessment of his competitors, and our internal projections for the logistics sector. The kind of intelligence that could give an entrepreneur a massive advantage if he knew how to use it, which apparently he didn't since his company was currently circling the drain like a financial turd that wouldn't flush. We spent the morning building what Rafi called the comprehensive case file. Every piece of evidence that proved Sabrina and Trent had been planning this betrayal for months while taking advantage of my resources and my trust. Calendar entries, message timestamps, financial transactions, location data, the kind of documentation that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. But here's where my team proved why they were worth every penny I paid them. They didn't just collect evidence. They crafted strategy. "We're not going public with any of this," Dra explained as she organized the files into neat piles. "No social media posts, no angry emails, no dramatic confrontations. We document everything. We file the appropriate legal notices, and we let the system work the way it's supposed to work." The notice of separation was filed that afternoon. Clean, professional, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting temporary custody arrangements that would give me every weekend, plus 2 weeknight dinners per week. The prenup clauses were invoked, specifically the sections dealing with marital misconduct and misuse of confidential business information. Tessa updated our investor communications with conflict disclosures, noting that Northbridge was withdrawing from the Trent Mallory opportunity due to newly discovered personal and professional conflicts of interest. Nothing dramatic, nothing vindictive, just the kind of boring legal language that covers your ass while ending someone else's dreams. The impact on Trent's company was immediate and brutal. His board asked him to step aside pending review of the conflict of interest issues. The bank that was supposed to provide bridge funding suddenly had concerns about leadership stability. The vendor relationships that were already strained started snapping like overstretched rubber bands. By Wednesday evening, Trent was calling from blocked numbers, probably hoping I'd pick up and we could have some kind of man-to-man conversation about working things out. Maybe he thought he could explain his way out of this mess. Convinced me that sleeping with my wife was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right combination of apologies and business concessions. I let every call go to voicemail, not out of anger but out of strategy. Every attempted contact was more evidence. Every block number call was another entry in the timeline. Every desperate message was proof that consequences were starting to bite. "Logan, please call me back," read the transcription of his first voicemail. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the investment situation. A misunderstanding, right? Like accidentally sleeping with an investor's wife was the kind of honest mistake that could happen to anyone." The second voicemail was more desperate. "We need to talk about this like professionals. There are a lot of people depending on this deal." The third one was just sad. "Please, I know we can work something out." I saved all of them, forwarded the transcriptions to DA, and went home to my empty lake house to drink good whiskey and watch my marriage die in real time through legal documents and financial statements. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. Sometimes it's just stepping back and letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices, documented and filed away for future reference. Without the wire transfer, Trent's company imploded faster than a cheap umbrella in a hurricane. Senior engineers started jumping ship when their paychecks bounced. Turns out, loyalty doesn't pay rent, and software developers have options. The fancy office lease they'd signed in South Lake Union suddenly looked like financial suicide when cash flow disappeared overnight. Suppliers who'd been operating on net 30 payment terms switched to cash on delivery faster than you could say credit risk. The Port Authority contracts that were supposed to be Trent's ticket to the big leagues started developing mysterious complications. Funny how quickly revolutionary partnerships turn into, we'll call you back when word gets around about funding problems. Meanwhile, Sabrina was discovering that adultery doesn't come with comprehensive benefits. Her SUV got towed from Trent's condo complex after 3 days of sitting there uninsured. Apparently, the building management takes liability seriously. Her card got declined at Marigold Bistro, that overpriced brunch place where she used to hold court with her business school friends. Every Thursday, the condo association posted a delinquency notice on Trent's door. Turns out when your startup's burning through cash faster than a meth lab burns through pseudoephedrine, keeping up with luxury housing costs becomes challenging. 2 weeks after the wire got pulled, Sabrina showed up at the lake house gate looking like she'd been crying for days. Eyes red, voice small, designer clothes wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in them. "Logan, this is a misunderstanding," she said through the intercom. I walked out to meet her, keeping my hands by my sides and my voice level. A misunderstanding doesn't cost $500 million. "I need help." I handed her Dar's business card. "Everything goes through council now, and the kid schedule stays exactly as written." That night, Trent's company issued a press release about strategic restructuring to better serve stakeholder interests. 3 sentences that said absolutely nothing while confirming everything. The kind of corporate speak that translates to, "We're fucking" in every language. The space Sabrina had asked for was getting very quiet indeed. The court granted temporary custody arrangements that looked suspiciously like what Dar had proposed 3 weeks earlier. Funny how judges appreciate well-documented evidence and reasonable requests over emotional manipulation and desperate power plays. The Honorable Patricia Chun warned both parties that the children's welfare comes first, but her eyes lingered on Sabrina when she said it. In that sterile courtroom surrounded by lawyers and legal documents, I said exactly 17 words total. Dra had prepared me well. Speak only when spoken to. Answer questions directly. Let the evidence tell the story. Results spoke louder than righteous indignation ever could. Back home. And yeah, it was home again, not just the lake house. Raffi showed up with Thai takeout and 2 PlayStation controllers. We spent the evening playing FIFA and trash-talking each other's digital soccer skills like we were still 22. And the biggest worry in our lives was whether we'd pass organic chemistry. Omar texted photos from the office. "Our team signing a clean partnership agreement with Morrison Pacific, a legitimate logistics operator with actual contracts and honest financial projections. No drama, no conflicts of interest, no smooth-talking entrepreneurs who confused confidence with competence. Just solid business with solid people who understood that reputation matters more than charisma." Tessa forwarded a message from Marcus Aderelius. "Confidence in Northbridge remains high. Looking forward to our next opportunity together." I looked at the framed photo on my desk. Jax and Mila at last summer's camping trip. Mud on their faces and joy in their eyes. I kept the lake house, my company, my reputation, and most importantly, my kids' trust. The court schedule gave me every weekend and Wednesday dinners, which meant more time with them than I'd had when I was married and working 80-hour weeks. I let go of the part of me that thought love could be purchased with generosity. I let go of the need to fund everyone else's happiness while neglecting my own. Sabrina once said I didn't know how to be big in a room. She was wrong about that, like she was wrong about a lot of things. I don't raise my voice to be big. I raise the standard. And when someone texts you asking for space, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is give them exactly what they asked for, plus all the consequences they didn't see coming.